And we're live. Welcome to Interchain FM, your monthly podcast for all things interop and frontier tech related. I'm Chain Going Chain, your host for this podcast. In this episode, we're here with JP, who is a researcher at THORChain, which is one of the first cross-chain decentralized exchanges that was launched with Cosmos SDK and Tendermint Core. THORChain currently has 324 million TVL, placing it at the top 25 of DEXs by TVL if it were represented on DeFi Pulse. THORChain is a multi-chain DEX, and it allows anyone to earn interest on native layer 1 assets without wrapping them as an ERC20 by depositing them into the DEX. So in the next hour, you're going to get a crash course on everything related to THORChain. Welcome to the show, JP.
Thanks for having me on. I'd be happy to share my perspective on what THORChain is today and where it could be in the future.
Yeah, very excited to have you on. Can you tell us what your involvement with THORChain in the past few years has been?
Yeah, so I've been helping the team out with mainly the research behind some of the architecture of THORChain, around its liquidity model, its financial model, in terms of how it's going to tackle things like synthetics, derivatives, lending, and more, but also how the system secures itself through mechanisms like the incentive pendulum, and just coupling economic incentives to ensure that the system is secure. So mainly in research, I do a bit of development when I need to. And yeah, that's what I do.
And we will touch on all of those concepts later in the episode, including in the incentive pendulum and break down what that really is. Just to get on the same baseline, let's do a round of definitions because you've thrown around some words here, including synthetics, derivatives, and wrapped assets. So maybe we should disambiguate what those mean.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you want to hold an asset and then trade it, such as Bitcoin, Bitcoin is extremely good at being a decentralized currency that can resist capture and evade centralization. Now, Satoshi did add some basic scripting, but it's extremely opinionated and kind of boxes you into a corner what you can and can't do with Bitcoin unspent transaction outputs, how you spend them and how you consume those outputs to do things. So Bitcoin as a base layer can do very basic things, time lock outputs, multi-sig outputs, but that hasn't really been widely used. The Lightning Network uses hash time lock contracts a lot and check time lock verify. So these are some scripts. Some of them were actually added after Satoshi left. So they've been forked into the protocol.
Yeah, P2SH.
Yeah. However, you can't actually do anything. You can't have just absolute freedom what you can and can't do with Bitcoin. So the basic idea of being able to build an exchange layer on top of Bitcoin or in the Bitcoin protocol, that ship has probably sailed many, many years ago, and it's very unlikely that will happen. So it's been necessary to trade Bitcoin, but outside of the ledger. So deposit your Bitcoin into a centralized exchange, get an IOU token, and then trade with also USD IOU tokens. So like your USD balance. And, Mt. Gox was famous for this. You deposit your cash in using PayPal, trading IOUs, and then you're able to withdraw out. And unfortunately, the exchanges in 2021 are still basically what Mt. Gox was back in, almost 10 years ago, which is quite disappointing because, 10 years, no real innovation there. So that's the fundamental problem. There's been one way to solve that, and that is to use atomic swaps. So atomic swaps use basically an idea that you can have two decoupled chains like Litecoin and Bitcoin. And then we have two members, Alice and Bob. They both make transactions but spend it in such a way that, and then they share basically information. And then now Bob can spend what was originally Alice's output, but only Bob can spend. And as soon as he does that, he unlocks information on chain that allows Alice to then only spend her newly swapped Litecoin. So that's an atomic swap, but it needs two things. It needs two compatible chains Bitcoin and Litecoin, it needs two people to come together to agree on a price and a time frame in which to do this, because if one doesn't do the end of the bargain, it needs to basically safely unwrap itself. And then you need a price to agree on in order to do that. So lots of problems. I mean, it's really good for P2P. And so things like BISC and a few other exchanges out there do use atomic swaps as the foundational exchange layer. But it doesn't really do much more than just P2P trades. So that's the main issue. It's bad user experience, that's P2P, and it's very cumbersome. Now in 2018, well actually before, in 2017, Bancor kind of launched with the idea that you can have pooled liquidity using Ethereum smart contracts. So you'd be able to put two assets in a pool together, and their vision was Bancor Network Token and these kind of smart relay tokens which connected to other assets in these liquidity reserves, and then you can trade between the liquidity reserves. That was Bancor's idea. They launched late 2017, and in 2018 they were really the only kind of peer-to-pool. So there's a new idea of now, instead of being P2P, you're now peer-to-pool. So you put your money, people put the money into these pools, which mainly was Bancor, and then now you can trade not with Bancor but with the pools. Now, the Bancor's first iteration was a little bit cumbersome. It was hard to enter and exit. It wasn't very gas efficient. That came later. But it missed two main things: simplicity and incentives, or clear incentives. Now, Vitalik Buterin suggested that the pool model could be replaced with a much simpler idea. He called it, or he phrased it as XYK on a Reddit thread, I think it was in 2016.
X times Y equals K.
Yeah.
He said X, Y, K. Okay.
Yeah. So basically the two reserves, X and Y, if you multiply them together, they should always equal a constant K. And that's the basic idea of Hayden's implementation in Uniswap v1, which was to literally take XYK, put it into a smart contract. But this solved two things. It now made it permissionless. That was a big innovation of Uniswap v1, to represent pool ownership as just ERC20 tokens. So the total supply equals K, and people's ownership of the pool is basically them holding ERC20 tokens. So that was actually a big breakthrough, very impressive stuff for Uniswap v1 to kind of have that innovative idea to represent a pool as just a ERC20 token. We now know them as liquidity tokens. That was the innovation of v1, but it made it super simple, and also the incentives were fixed. It was very clear that if you owned 10% of a liquidity pool, then you were entitled to 10% of all the liquidity fees in that pool. Liquidity fees are retained in the pool when trades are made. So it fixed those two things, and it was super simple. And they rolled out in DevCon 4. I believe it was, it was Ukraine. I was there actually when Hayden was on stage launching it. And I was actually, that day, I put liquidity into Uniswap v1 that very day. So it was a day zero Uniswap liquidity provider. And I was amazed at the simplicity and the execution of that. There was only $1 million in liquidity on that day, but it was very impressive. And I spoke to the team and I said, this is the future of exchange for sure, because it solves all those issues. So that's what THORChain's approach is, to have a peer-to-pool model, but instead of the reserves of assets sitting in a smart contract, THORChain, the state machine, abstracts them, and they can be in any chain. So now you can have the Bitcoin reserve on the Bitcoin chain, and the Litecoin reserve on the Litecoin chain, and then this asset which connects them, being the Rune asset, living on the Rune ledger. So there's actually 3 blockchains involved: Bitcoin, Litecoin, and now THORChain, to connect those two pools. So now you can trade peer-to-pool. You put the Bitcoin in on the Bitcoin pool, and then 5 seconds later, out pops your Litecoin, and it's traded at the prices in those two pools via the liquidity asset, which is Rune. They're very similar to Bancor, where BNT is the liquidity routing asset, and THORChain Rune is the liquidity routing asset. Long-winded way to address your question about atomic swaps and pools, but hopefully that was a scenic route of arriving at peer-to-pools.
Yes, a scenic route it was. And let's go into the weeds. So you alluded to the fact that you have a peer-to-pool scheme going on where somebody is able to deposit Bitcoin and they have to pull in an equivalent amount of Rune in order to get Litecoin out. So let's talk about that model, because it is that is where THORChain diverges from Uniswap, right? The XYK model, the constant function market making model.
Yeah, so Uniswap diverged from XYK, which is interesting. So Uniswap V1 was XYK with ETH as the settlement asset. So it was ETH everything. And by the way, it was real ETH. It wasn't wrapped ETH. Then Uniswap V2 came out and it just said, hey, it's just going to be any. And we'll use a smart routing wrapper that's able to detect the shortest way and the shortest way between two assets. But now you can have any ERC20 with any ERC20, and they deprecated ETH and they only use WETH. So when you actually deposit ETH, they wrap it into WETH and put that into a pool. So it's only ERC20s. So that was still XYK. But Uniswap V3 has decoupled from XYK with basically price-bound liquidity that's not being rebalanced. So as a LP, you deposit your liquidity in a range and just say, hey, I want my liquidity to function in this range. So basically it's XYK, but you choose the area on the curve. XYK, by default, you get basically up to infinity and down to 0. So the full infinite curve. But Uniswap V3, you just say, I want to provide my liquidity on a small chunk. So that's Uniswap V3. SushiSwap has retained the basic XYK model. So now you can have, your SushiSwap is great for passive LPers who just want to set and forget the liquidity. Uniswap V3 is better for active LPs if you want to actively put your liquidity on a small range and maximize your capital efficiency. So better execution and more fees, but it's coming at a cost of active management. If Uniswap V3 is open up for things like yield aggregators like Yearn to take that opportunity and provide active management of the liquidity in return for fees. So Uniswap V3 has created a new market, which is pretty interesting. But as of yesterday, Curve was taking the XYK formula, multiplying it by an amplifier, but only doing it for like-to-like assets. Curve V2 that came out yesterday, very interesting. It's smooth price-bound. No, so it's smooth liquidity that's auto-rebalanced, but concentrated around the current exponential moving average price, all handled by the Curve infrastructure. There's some crazy math going on behind the scenes. Have to solve the Newton equation on chain. It costs about 34,000 gas to do that, to solve it in real time when you do a transaction, which is quite a feat when you think about it. But yeah, some fascinating stuff happening in the AMM space. But your question, what differentiates THORChain with Uniswap or Curve or SushiSwap? THORChain is most like SushiSwap because it retains the XYK formula, but it has just a dynamic fee provisioning. So it charges different fees depending on how much you demand that liquidity. But that's the fundamentals of how the AMM work. But THORChain stands alone in the sense that it abstracts the liquidity away from different chains. So we can look out to all these different chains and maintain vault balances on all of them in a cohesive liquidity pool network. So yeah, with the Curve, SushiSwap, Uniswap are constrained to EVM smart contracts, whereas THORChain is much bigger than that, and it's looking out in different chains. It doesn't use smart contracts; it uses a state machine. So it can be much bigger, yeah, for sure.
So in a future, in a time where we are in the future, do you imagine that the trend of DEXs being kind of revolving around the ETH1 ecosystem continuing, or do you think that other chains, other multi-chain hubs such as THORChain would kind of take the reins and become de facto liquidity rail?
The future is definitely multi-chain. You can't say that there are clear winners right now, the Ethereum ecosystem. I actually don't believe it's really the Ethereum ecosystem. I am more bullish on the Ethereum virtual machine attaining Lindy and living on for quite some time. That bit of infrastructure is an absolute beast. It is a huge monument, a monumental achievement, what the EVM can do. We're going to see the EVM get Lindy for sure. So a bit like how Linux is everywhere, but almost no value accrues to Linus Torvald through his work of Linux, apart from, he's present today, but he never charged for it. But as a result, Linux is used everywhere. It's almost Tesla used Linux as their main computer operating system.
Yeah, it's in every single operating system.
Yeah, exactly. So I believe the EVM is going to get Lindy like that, and it will be the default go-to virtual machine for these blockchains. But in terms of like which layer one will win, obviously Ethereum, the ecosystem, and its roll-ups are very competitive and also have a really strong network effect. And you must have heard Vitalik's recent interview with Lex Friedman recently, but having an asset that you can center on creates very sticky fan base. We probably have iPhones, but we're not very loyal to the Apple ecosystem. We're just stuck because we like our cloud and photos or whatever. But imagine if we got a free Apple stock that came with it, then we'd be much more loyal to the Apple ecosystem because we're now vested. So that's what the asset has done. It's got very sticky fan base, network effects. Mm-hmm. But the future is definitely multi-chain. They're going to have different implementations, and clearly you will always have Bitcoin, and Bitcoin will always be a very neutral and simple base layer, because that's what it's trying to be. It's trying to be a global censorship resistant monetary asset. It's not trying to do much more than that. So we'll always have Bitcoin. We will have the EVM ecosystem for sure. And if Elon keeps carrying on, then we're always going to have Dogecoin, because he will keep driving network effect into that ecosystem. So yeah, the future is multi-chain. So do we resolve ourselves to the fact that we're stuck with centralized exchanges, or should we try and do something about that? There's a couple of ways to do that. One is a system like THORChain, which is able to connect to these different chains without wrapping them and give you direct L1 pools. Or you can use wrapping systems. So something like Ren protocol can wrap Bitcoin, Dogecoin, Litecoin, and put them on the EVM ecosystem as ERC20s. Or if you don't subscribe to that, then you can just use wrap Bitcoin from BitGo, which is definitely centralized. And there's definitely a centralization risk there. If you go back 40, 60 years, gold was an awesome monetary asset. It just sucked at being money because it had to be vaulted, it had to be custodied, and it was captured. The reason why we were kicked off the gold standard is not because gold was not a good monetary asset. It's an awesome monetary asset. It's because it had vulnerabilities. It was captured, it was centralized, it was vaulted. So it was very easy to move people from holding real gold to move them to gold pieces of gold IOUs, and then finally forced redemption. Hand back your gold or else, because we got all your gold. Does that make sense? So that's the problem here, is if you let custodians carry your Bitcoin, then it's gonna follow the same train as why we got kicked off the gold standard. So don't accept that. Don't accept centralized custodians to carry your Bitcoin, because you'll go the same way as 1971 when we got kicked off the gold standard.
Yeah, totally. So, if individuals are sending their real Bitcoin, real valuable, scarce asset to an exchange, that allows them to hoard it, and then for them to create derivative assets for you to exchange off of it. And then they collect the fees. And then if every single person wanted to withdraw the Bitcoin from the exchange, they would have effectively a bank run.
Correct. And I'm not sure if you've been following much in the movement of virtual asset service providers and all that legislation, but they, as in regulators, want to create this intra-network between regulated custodians of Bitcoin. And so there's vast to vast Bitcoin transactions. So they'll only allow you to transfer Bitcoin between these regulated entities. So it's like Hotel California. You can come in anytime, but you can never leave. And because they control this network that sits above Bitcoin, that's able to KYC and control and like have full surveillance, how are you going to escape that? How are you going to ever go check out? You have to basically sell your Bitcoin to cash, withdraw it, and then trade it peer-to-peer back into the unregulated Bitcoin. The two, if we keep allowing this to go ahead, we'll have two types of Bitcoin, which is the regulated good Bitcoin and the unregulated bad Bitcoin. And this completely the wrong direction. So we can't let that happen. And the time is now to give users the ability to gain yield and trading functions on real Bitcoin without centralized custodians. And centralization exists on a continuum. You can't just say, it's not black and white. This is centralized, this is decentralized. You're now in the magic fairyland of decentralization. You can do anything you want. It's a continuum. So like holding your Bitcoin in BlockFi is probably the pinnacle of being centralized. BitGo is a little bit more decentralized because it has more custodian signatories. Then we get into things like Ren protocol. They've been open about. There are team keys that control, the redemption keys. So there's a little bit more decentralized. Then we go into things like Keep Network, which is even more decentralized, but still there's stagnation of key signatories. And to the point where I think THORChain could be the most decentralized at this current point in time. There are some more designs coming out that kind of are exciting because they will use some awesome features coming with Bitcoin Schnorr that will allow. So here's a bit of a technical side. The reason why it kind of limits the signatory set is because Bitcoin native multisig only allows about 15 signers. So really limited, right? So exchanges are limited to that. But then TSS came out in 2019, thanks to Gennaro and Stephen Goldfeather and Gennaro, who released the TSS, Threshold Signature Scheme, which allows basically an unlimited number of participants in an ECDSA signing set.
You got muted.
Can you hear me now? I just
Yeah.
Yeah. The only limitation is the signing speed. So it increases quadratically. So you're probably limited to about 30 to 40 signers where you kind of tap out. And that's the limitation of THORChain right now, is each vault is limited to about 30 to 40. There are solutions to increase the set. But Bitcoin coming this later this year will have Schnorr, and Schnorr allows you to asynchronously aggregate signatures. So theoretically, you can have signing sets of 10,000, which is really, really cool. So as of 2022, when Schnorr's in and done, you should see potential to have huge distributed custodians of Bitcoin. So I'm very excited about that.
Great. That was a really lengthy answer, and I appreciate it. But let's talk about Rune. Speaking of sticky assets that creates a shelling point around a certain protocol. So Rune has certain properties, and it ties directly into the incentive pendulum for THORChain, right?
Yes.
We want to talk about that. So
yeah, let's do it. So THORChain is not trying to be this kind of like decentralized monetary layer. Rune is not a money. THORChain just out the gate says, it needs to be better than 3 dudes with a multi-sig. BitMEX famously has 3 dudes with a multi-sig. Those 3 dudes currently have criminal charges being served to them, and they're on the way to fight those in the US right now. The 4th was actually a computer, and that's why every day at, I believe it was 9 a.m. Hong Kong time or something, 2 of those dudes plus the computer would come together and sign redemptions on that. But it was captured, obviously. They're being served right now. So it just wants to be better than that. And out the gate, the design for THORChain can tolerate 67 out of 100. That's a huge improvement over 3 dudes with a multi-sig. Huge, huge improvement. And the way it achieves this, but THORChain, like I said, THORChain is only trying to say it's better than, it's multiples of 10 better than the current status quo. And it's only trying to secure the assets in its vaults. And it does that
by coupling incentives such that the bonded security of the nodes who maintain this network is always twice the value that they're trying to secure. And very simply, all it does is take the block reward, adds it to the income generated in a block from liquidity fees, and it splits it 50-50 between liquidity providers and nodes. If it's in an equilibrium. If it's insecure, so the nodes are not bonding enough to secure their assets, it can detect that because each pool is 50-50 coupled to Rune. So if it knows if it's holding $10 million worth of Rune in its vaults, then the other assets, no matter what they are also worth $10 million. Because if they weren't, then someone would be trading them. So because it knows the rough value of the assets in its vaults, it just needs to say that there needs to be twice as much Rune bonded as pooled. That's it. So then it can split the reward between the two discrete actors, nodes or LPs, and pay them depending on what's wrong with the system. If it's insecure, it pays more to nodes. It gives them more incentives to bond more. If it's way too secure, like over bonded, or what the system calls itself inefficient, because it's got way too much security, then it diverts that income to liquidity providers and pays them more. So you can see it's got this ratcheting system where it's trying to increase the security of its network. At the same time, it's increasing the liquidity of this network. And that's happening right now. That's why if you're on Twitter, you can see the campaign, raise the caps. The raise the caps is a bit of a safety measure, but those caps are going to be removed soon. And it will then all the members are going to be beholden to the incentive pendulum. So they will need to work out themselves what to do rather than providing liquidity up to a cap, which is kind of like protecting the network in its early stages, because when it's bootstrapping, it's quite vulnerable to large shifts in the incentive pendulum. If the incentive pendulum is bouncing off insecure to inefficient all day long, then it just could cause weird edge cases where it gets into a corner that it can't get itself out of. But over time, as the system builds up inertia and stability, then it's less likely to end up in a corner it can't get out of. So that will happen fairly soon. But yeah, so Rune is just simply a means to detect the value of the assets in its vaults, and then it's an economic incentive to drive the correct behavior between its two primary users, nodes who are providing security and liquidity providers who are providing liquidity. So that's the answer.
And what do you expect to happen after that cap has been removed?
Yeah, so liquidity providers will go, yay, no more caps, and they'll pile in, as they have been, and it will drive the pooled Rune up to a point at which pooled Rune will equal bonded Rune. So if too much liquidity jumps in the system, then yeah, it will quickly get up to the point where pooled Rune equals bonded Rune. Now, this is the point at which the system won't let it get any worse. It will actually start refunding LPs and basically saying, no, we can't let it get, because if it gets to a point where there's more pooled Rune than bonded Rune, the system's insecure. Theoretically, these nodes can take all the money and they will make money because, they'll be able to steal more assets than they have put up in a bond. Now, the reason why that it works normally where it's got twice as much bonded as pooled is because every 3 days the system churns and it kicks out nodes and it brings in more nodes. And it actually it discharges all pending rewards and allows these nodes to leave the system if they wish. So every 3 days, the cost basis of these nodes are being reset. They're basically saying, if your bond is worth 5 million, you basically can realize this right now. So when they churn back in, they have a cost basis that they've realized, right? They didn't put it in when it was 1 cent and then 1,000x later and it's now $10 and but because they only paid at 1 cent, and now they've got a huge unrealized cost basis increase. No, that's not the case. That cost basis is constantly being reset from the churn. So these nodes, they understand acutely what their bond is worth, so they'll never contemplate stealing more than what they put into the system. The other reason for the churn is because there are signing keys that are constantly reused. Any of these nodes, eventually, if they could lose access to these keys, and the vaults could get locked up. So by constantly churning, it basically forces these keys to be constantly regenerated for only 3 days at a time. So, and what are the chances then in a 3-day period that 1/3 of the network lose access to the keys all at once? It could happen if like one service provider gets shut down, which is an ongoing concern. But by rechurning the keys frequently and regenerating them, you can prove that they're always alive. The network has always the ability to sign from those keys. And the third reason is it constantly churns out old actors. So if too many actors gain a footing in a network, they can stagnate and they can get a controlling stake in the network and never leave. And because they never leave, they stay in the longest and then they just own the network, right? They just get more and more centralized. So by kicking them out all the time, it stops, it evades centralization because it stops anyone ever getting a foothold in the network. Yeah, so that's how the security works. And that's what will happen when the caps are released. It will go up to its limits, for sure.
How much of the federated sidechain model has THORChain taken from that?
So a federated sidechain like Blockstream Liquid or Rootstock, there's a static signing set. Blockstream have, don't have a static signing set. That's like
to
any sidechain. Like I believe Matic have a static signing set. Just don't. Just to any protocol designer out there, just do not accept a static signing set. Do everything you can to churn it 2 to 3 days, not 30 days, not 3 months, as often as frequent as possible. Because if you have a static signing set, the network just becomes captured. And it's very hard to kick out the older signers. Well, why would they leave? They can get a foothold. So yeah, Blockstream Liquid, static signing. I mean, they've just recently released this new version or this new design, which could have dynamic federation set. But then you can ask, well, how does this dynamic federation set, how are they choosing the signers? THORChain only chooses new signers every 3 days based on the size of the bond that they're putting up, not based on IP address, not based on logos, not based on marketing campaigns, not based on anything. It's anonymous nodes rocking up with a monetary bond, and THORChain goes, you know what, we're just going to pick the highest bond. You're in. So anyone can see it on mile out. Anyone can join that queue. Anyone can front run that queue, and they do if they want. So that's how THORChain is different. So you couldn't call THORChain is federated, but it's permissionless. It's not even federated. Federated implies that there is permissioning going on, that there is someone choosing who's in the federation. THORChain is not. It chooses anyone can join that queue. You just got to rock up with the right bond.
Yeah, so it sounds like what you have is a set of 40 signers, right, at any point, who can become
100. Yeah, right now it's in a
100.
state where it's expanding. So every 3 days it kicks out 2 and pulls in 3. I think the team want to change it so it kicks out 2 and pulls in 4, so it's able to expand faster and get to 100. But probably next question is, 5 minutes ago I just said that TSS is probably usable up to 40. But THORChain has a design up to 100. So how does that work? So THORChain actually shards. It splits up its signing vaults into 2 or more. The limit's 40. So when it gets to 41, it will suddenly split into 2 of 20, 1 of 20, and 1 of 21. And then it will slowly grow these 2 vaults until they both hit 40 again, or 41, and then split them again. So it can keep doing on this. And then that actually solves the limitations of the TSS, because now the system can keep growing. It can have as many vaults as it wants because they are secured on the state machine, and the state machine uses EDSA key aggregation thanks to the BFT consensus engine of Tendermint, and that probably can go up to 250 to 300 nodes. So yeah, I mean, the team are keeping an eye on Cosmos Hub. I believe Cosmos Hub is up to 125 validators right now. So probably just slightly in lag of that for THORChain design. So if Cosmos Hub go to 150 or 200 validators, then expect THORChain to also bump up, because this is unknown territory. No one's ever done it before. So it's very important that a live network goes ahead, does it first. You wouldn't want some weird bug in Tendermint to suddenly halt the chain because it clicks over 141 or something, and then, I don't know, there's an Oppo 1 error or whatever. Anyway, these things happen.
Certainly. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, going back to Tendermint and the Cosmos SDK, why is THORChain built as its own blockchain rather than as a smart contract on Ethereum?
So the Cosmos engine and Tendermint consensus engine is by far the most mature and capable BFT consensus blockchain protocol, SDK, what do you want to call it? For sure. It's most mature, it's got the best developer documentation, it's most capable. Things like Cosmos allow you to put smart contracts on this BFT engine. So it's such a capable ecosystem. You look out there and to see the others, and it's just none of them are there yet. So Cosmos is by far the leader in this kind of tooling. And the beautiful thing about the design of, I guess, the BFT is because you have that cutoff, that timeout on the blocks, you know you're going to get a block committed every 5 to 6 seconds. I mean, you can spool that up and complete blocks every 2 to 3 seconds. But you're just going to open up to like centralization via service providers if you do that. So 5 to 6 seconds is enough. And it's BFT, so you do have a bounded validator set, but there are means to churn them. Like if you've got 100 active and then you've got another 100 standby, the actual validator set is 200 because you're constantly churning the standby into the active and vice versa. So the pool of validators is actually 200, not 100. And so like theoretically, let's say THORChain goes with 300 validators and then has another 300 in standby. You know, the consensus set is 600, just time delayed because it's got to churn them in. But yeah, Cosmos is by far the leader and it's the most stable. And not in a smart contract because this has to be a live network, right? It has to witness events that occur on these kind of isolated chains, report them into a state machine, which is logically centralized, and then execute business logic on those events. So once you get consensus of what happened in the outside world, like what happened on Bitcoin and Litecoin, then you can execute the business logic, swap, add liquidity, remove, do cool things. And a state machine environment is the best for that. Because it's live. Every 5 seconds, it wakes up and does something. You know, it literally has a begin block routine and an end block routine. So every 5 seconds, you can do logic, like, you know, modify your state queue, your swap queue, or, you know, liquidate positions, or just wake up and do stuff. The THORChain wakes up and like kicks out validators and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's very powerful. A smart contract is passive. It just sits there. You have to poke it for it to do something. And like, you know, the solution is to have a keeper network, like keeper DAO, that's poking these smart contracts and getting them, you know, keeper bots to do stuff. But, you know, that's another whole giant complexity theater of, you know, trust and trust minimization. So yeah, a live state machine built by Cosmos is by far the obvious choice. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. And so as this blockchain that is going to be aggregating liquidity amongst various pools that you have, and you're going to be multi-chain, how's it going to be different from SushiSwap? So the point of my question is, somebody on Twitter goes, okay, SushiSwap has all of the functionality of THORChain. It's going to consume all of the functionality of THORChain later, and so why not just use SushiSwap? And then somebody at Thor said, well, you just fork THORChain.
Yeah, I think I saw that tweet. So an AMM protocol on multiple chains is not the same as a multi-chain AMM. What I mean by that is, you know, SushiSwap has kind of this kind of liquidity on Polygon, Binance Smart Chain, Ethereum Layer 1, Ethereum Layer 2, but the liquidity is not aggregated. So they would need to, you know, if you make a trade on Polygon, SushiSwap, you're not trading against the sum of the liquidity as a whole. So that's one thing. The second thing is this kind of environment is well built for EVM chains. So, you know, an EVM chain is just where all your smart contracts live and are executed every 15 seconds when you poke it with transactions. But Bitcoin is not an EVM chain. Dogecoin is not an EVM chain. Does it make sense? So even like Solana, although you can port your code over, it's not an EVM chain. So you're going to need something that can handle these dissimilar computing, monetary layers. So that's why you need something like THORChain, which is very agnostic. In fact, THORChain has no awareness of how balances are held in different chains. It has no idea what a UTXO is, what a token is, ERC20 or whatever, because that's handled when the data is kind of transmuted into a witness event into THORChain. So THORChain is very agnostic. Yeah, and like the multi-chain is the future. SushiSwap is an excellent grassroots ecosystem with an awesome roadmap. It's an AMM protocol on multiple chains, but it's not a multi-chain AMM. A multi-chain AMM is able to hook up different chains together, allow you to trade a single giant pile of liquidity and not separate liquidity pools. But yeah, now they can go ahead and fork THORChain if they want to. But the problem is the Sushi token is never been marketed, has never been issued as a liquidity and security asset. The Sushi token has always been issued as a governance token for the SushiSwap ecosystem, which is very, very different to being a liquidity security asset. So the distribution is all wrong. If they wanted to move, you can't just grab this token and suddenly say, okay, it's now a liquidity security asset. You need to either get all your holders to pivot, or you need to churn them out and get new holders in. Because remember, it's not the token, it's the people holding the token that are what's needed in an ecosystem to affect the given behavior that you want. So for them to pivot, so SushiSwap to pivot into multi-chain AMM, it's probably going to take 12, 18, 24 months to do that. And, the whole time, they might as well just fork THORChain's code. THORChain doesn't care. Like the team don't care whether THORChain wins or loses in this giant battle. They just want to be part. They want to contribute to the idea that it's time to end centralized custodians. It's time to end centralized exchanges, because you don't want another 1971 happening with custodian Bitcoin. You don't want half the network, the majority of the network, kicked off the network and kicked off censorship characteristics, and immutability because the custodian had a phone call from a regulator or a state head. You don't want that, and you only get one shot at it, right? And you don't. We need to choose the road now, and THORChain is just one solution among many. It's one of the correct solutions for sure. But no, the team are not here to. I meet with them, most times a week, but they're not here to, be the #1 exchange in the world. No, they want to be part of the drive. They want to be part of the group that chose the right fork in the road, and to bring people to follow them down that road. We don't want another 1971 happening.
Yeah, and you built just the solution for people to walk down, rather than it not being there and them having to default to something like BlockFi.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, BlockFi can keep their business model. They're kind of like, obviously they're a huge marketing engine to bring in that kind of liquidity and that kind of user adoption. When the THORChain is able to scale up to that level, there's no reason why BlockFi can't wrap THORChain's liquidity pools and just offer an interface and a marketing engine, charge some affiliate fees. But the big difference is BlockFi won't be a custodian anymore. They'll just be an interface. And the real liquidity is in this permissionless decentralized protocol. And if BlockFi suddenly decide to block the users one day, or like block withdrawals, the users can just go around and use another interface and withdraw liquidity that way. So they're no longer the gatekeepers. They're just a window. Yeah,
that's great. That's a really great way of saying it. So I'm really glad that THORChain exists and that we can keep our keys, keep our coins.
Exactly.
Okay, so I will pull some questions from the audience. Let's see.
We can talk about some of THORChain's finance features like synths, lending, composites. There's some pretty cool stuff there.
Todd Make asks, what do you think of DAGs?
Directed acyclical graphs. Yeah, it's a different blockchain structure. So a blockchain is basically a sequential series of events that refer back in time, but they are bundled up into blocks, and they all link up directly. That's a blockchain. A DAG is a very loose structure, so these events can refer back to other events, but there's no real definition of what a block is. It's just a blob. So the whole DAG proceeds as a blob forward. It is a different structure. I mean, there are some high-profile DAG blockchains out there, but it's a little bit more unwieldy to build like a smart contract chain around, because of it can be quite asynchronous and it's hard to get correct time ordering. I'm not a super expert in DAGs. I know roughly. I think DAGs are an interesting structure. We will continue to see them iterate and innovate, but I'm still yet to see why someone would build on a DAG as opposed to blockchain, if that makes sense. But I'm not knocking on their innovation, certainly innovative, but they just need to be bundled up with better tooling, I feel. That's what's missing today. And I mean, you have things like Hedera, a very well-funded VC network that's doing this. So maybe they could solve the problems there.
Remains to be seen. So let's talk about THORChain and what financial assets you have. Do you have lending and borrowing on your platform? Like, what is there?
Yeah. So the unique thing about THORChain is it can't secure an unbounded amount of native assets. You can't just deposit Bitcoin into THORChain outside of the pool and wrap it and go, look, I want to lend this, I want to borrow this. Because it sits outside the pool, therefore it sits outside the incentive pendulum. Now the pool, you can see that the pool works to bond Rune to Bitcoin no matter the price of Rune, right? If the price of Rune is going up and down, then the Bitcoin will be traded in or out in respective to that Rune. So there's no kind of like evicting of this Bitcoin if the network becomes secure. It just means that there's just trading, taking the Bitcoin out of the network. If Rune price is going down, arbitrage just pulls Bitcoin out of the network naturally. And the users, the LPs, expect this because they don't mind the volatility. Whereas if you get Bitcoin in and you wrap it and you say, hey, look, 1,000 Bitcoin wrapped, and you tell these users, hey, you've got 1,000 wrapped Bitcoin, what are you going to do if suddenly the network becomes insecure? Are you going to evict your users and say, sorry, we can't store 1,000 Bitcoin anymore, we can only store 500. We're going to choose half of you and evict you from this network. Or do you just ignore that security problem and say, look, yeah, we can still store 1,000 Bitcoin, even though there's no way economically we can secure 1,000 Bitcoin? So that's a problem with wrapped assets. So THORChain can only secure liquidity assets in its pools. And synthetic assets are basically a design evolution on top of liquidity pools that allows the liquidity collateral to synthesize an asset which has the purchasing power of Bitcoin. So THORChain synthetic Bitcoin will always have the purchasing power and redemption into layer 1 Bitcoin at 1-to-1 at a small enough swap at all times. And it does this by using some sneaky math and some magic to do this. But if there's 1,000 synthetic Bitcoin, it means that these 1,000 holders can always exit any time they want through the liquidity pool, and it will always stay solvent. That's the whole idea. And now once you have this synthetic Bitcoin, then this synthetic Bitcoin, because it's backed by liquidity assets, which are making yield in a liquidity pool, you can return that yield back to the holder. So they're holding one synthetic Bitcoin, but it's earning 20% yield per year in the pool. So all the savings account does is it takes that yield out of the pool or the reserve and gives it back to the synth holder. So now they'll just by holding synthetic Bitcoin, you can get, 10, 20% APY, whatever the final number is, and that's yet to be set, from yield, just by holding. So it's like a cross-chain savings account. You can deposit any asset, USDT, ETH, Bitcoin, and earn a yield on it by holding it. So that's the cross-chain savings account that's going to come out shortly. The cool thing about synthetic assets as well is that they allow you to trade the L1 pools without settling to L1, to layer 1, which is very cool, but they're always fully secured. So you can basically trade layer 1 Bitcoin, but not have to settle in 10 minutes and pay, $10 fees. You can just settle in 5 seconds and pay, 20-cent fees. So that's synthetic assets. Then the team want to roll out lending. Now, interestingly, the big difference with this protocol and other ones is the protocol is always holding capital and it always has a large reserve. The reserve is constantly filled up by economic activity on the network. Now, this reserve is very well capitalized, so it can act as a bit of a bank, like a reserve, right? And so when we come to lending, it can do some really cool things that you probably won't see elsewhere because of these characteristics, such as fixed interest loans, lending capital from its own pools. Well, it's lending capital from its own reserve and executed through its own pools, which is fascinating stuff. So you can lock up Rune or synthetic Bitcoin, which is derived from real Bitcoin, or has the purchasing power of real Bitcoin, and get a loan out of any other L1 asset, fixed interest, because the protocol is the lender. Anyone can become a borrower, and the interest is paid back into the liquidity pools. So these LPs, the liquidity providers, just by putting liquidity in these pools, can get to earn extra income because the protocol is able to lend out the capital out to borrowers. So that's coming, and so yeah, it's fixed interest. Could be there is designed to be self-paying. So if you lock up synthetic Bitcoin and it's earning 20% APY, there's nothing to stop that APY for you being then diverted to pay off your loan constantly. You can even have a repayment schedule as well, taken from your collateral to pay off your loan, because the state machine wakes up every 5 seconds and does stuff. So it can wake up and service members and stuff like that. So that's the lending features. And like I said, it will have characteristics that you won't find anywhere else, where you can deposit layer 1 assets, borrow other layer 1 assets at a fixed interest rate for an indeterminate period of time. Very cool stuff.
That is very exciting. And it reminds me of 2014, hearing about Lending Club for the very first time with peer-to-peer lending. And it was great. You could earn, something as big as 7% interest rate, but now you do DeFi lending, and you don't need there's no creditability, and you don't need to apply and KYC through a platform, which is amazing. But that also brings you into the realm of Aave and Compound, right?
Yeah. So they use Aave and Compound use lending pools. So they have discrete lenders and borrowers, and then they try and use basically a leverage, which is the interest rate, to control the solvency of the system, because they can only lend out as much as the lenders provide, right? But if suddenly the lenders want to withdraw, then they need to claw back liquidity from the borrowers to stop the system going insolvent. So they have like a reserve rate, and then there's an interest rate which they use to claw back. So they'll increase the interest rate to claw back liquidity faster. But THORChain can never go insolvent because it's its own lender, so it doesn't need to claw back because it's not going to pull its own liquidity. Does it make sense? So that's the big difference. And it's cross-chain, so you don't need to wrap Bitcoin into it. You can just use L1 Bitcoin. And take my warning is, my heed is that if we allow everyone to just be happy with using wrapped assets, and we don't question the decentralization, we're going to go the way of gold was. And that's the word of warning, is we don't want that. So you've always got to be on the lookout for a system which is more decentralized, and move your assets over to that while you still can.
Fair enough. Let's go to the audience. Rockstar asks, actually, never mind. I'm not going to pull that one because I don't understand what the question is. Gunnar asks, do the high Rune bond requirements by validators to secure the network present a limitation to the total liquidity that THORChain can support?
So it's a good question. So nodes rock up and they put up a bond offer and they say, "Hey, I'm willing to bond 500,000 rune," and they're willing to do this. So the network chooses from the highest bonds, and if more people are willing to put up a bond and try and bid against each other, then the bond rate will increase. So the bond rate is only high because there are people willing to bond that high. So no, not really. The THORChain has to scale its security as the network scales. It can't do it fast because it doesn't like moving its security too quickly in a certain direction. It likes to be slow and methodical. So it could take 3 to 6 months to really scale up the security and therefore liquidity. But that's kind of what you want. You don't want a system that can just blow up and implode in your face overnight, for sure.
Ryan Bro asks, support for liquid staked asset pools?
So things like stake death from Lido Finance. Yeah, I mean, Steth itself is a rebase token, and rebase tokens, as of yet, aren't supported by THORChain because of various reasons. But wrapped Steth, bit of a mouthful, that can be supported, no problems. Yeah. The team is working with another team to build out, this might be more relevant as well, an IBC bridge. So IBC is very cool infrastructure. It allows two Cosmos chains with their own security models to negotiate and verify for themselves the correctness of incoming IBC transfers, and then basically mint tokens off this, and then allow redemption back to that same chain. So that will allow a very effective way to hook THORChain up to the IBC ecosystem like Cosmos, Akash, Luna, etc. So you can basically bridge in these assets. Obviously, these incoming IBC transfers can only be connected with a pool, because even still, you wouldn't want wrap tokens from these IBC networks, or peg tokens rather, to be coming unbounded. So they'll only be attached to pools, but with the connection, it will be, you'll still have a Cosmos wallet, and you'll be able to use an IBC transfer to swap at the same time. So swap your Cosmos into Bitcoin, or your Luna into Atom in one IBC transaction. Well, it's actually two IBC transactions, but yeah. So that's coming. It's very scalable as well. So it's the Bitcoin Bifrost is very state intensive. There's lots of stuff going on there. But the kind of Cosmos Atom bridge will be very state efficient for sure.
And when can users expect that to be deployed?
That's a good question. So it's happening at the moment. There are some issues that the teams are working through. There's a separate team working on it to build it. Yeah, look, in the next couple of months, it's a high priority bridge because it's very state efficient, and it's not a lot of burden on THORChain to support. And the Cosmos ecosystem is a great ecosystem. A lot of awesome node runners and validators, a great community, and just a very it's the right community to interface with for sure. And you have a community like Luna, which is an amazing community, amazing infrastructure, the largest algorithmic stablecoin out there, UST, one of the most stable coins as well. Very well built. Yeah, for sure. It's a great ecosystem, the Cosmos, Luna ecosystem, the Akash ecosystem, etc.
Okay. When can people expect IBC to be live on THORChain?
So THORChain is fitted for IBC right now, so it can technically support with no changes. It just needs to be integrated in a way that's respective to THORChain's security model, which is it will only secure assets in its pools. So it's a nuanced IBC bridge for sure. It's not your regular IBC bridge, but it's built on IBC infrastructure.
Okay. Going to take two final questions from the audience. Pop-Tart Pete asks, when do you think we will see the first pool get deactivated or destaged from the network? Some pools right now have weak volume and don't seem to bring much to the network.
But this happens all ongoing. So pools need to stay above 10,000 rune to stay active. The second they go below 10,000, they will get staged. And the network only brings on pools that have more than 10,000. So a weak heuristic is a deep pool attracts volume. So deeper pools, and you can check this out on THORSwap right now, that deep pools like Bitcoin, BNB, ETH have awesome volume depth ratios. You know, most days 10%, some days 100%. So like the volume over the pool is 1x the depth. And this is huge. Expect with Synths that this will increase even further because Synths execute way faster and for way less cost. So Synths will probably 10x, I don't know, maybe 5x, maybe 10x on crazy days for sure, because it's arbitrageurs don't need complicated bots anymore that need to send transactions on 5 different chains at once, right? Instead, they just arbitrage on a single chain on THORChain. So yeah, but when pools of big volume, so volume brings revenue to pools. And yeah, as long as they stay above 10,000 rune, there's no real cause for concern. Yeah.
Rockstar asks, what would be the ideal network status to fully lift the cap and go to mainnet? Is it a matter of liquidity or bond?
Definitely bond. Right now, I think there's 10 million rune bonded. Ideally, this is 20 million, so twice the number of nodes with the same amount of bond. So right now there's 20 nodes. So let's just say 40 nodes with 20 million bonded. It's probably a time at which it's good to take the caps off. But just understand that when those caps get taken off, it's basically saying that, all right, it's handing over to the users now. They need to understand what the status of the network is. If the network's underbonded and getting insecure, then they should probably withdraw the liquidity. And this is the correct behavior to do. And likewise, if the network's becoming very inefficient, there's way too much bond, then it's time to add liquidity. And they just need to keep an eye on the liquidity yield and the bond yield and choose their behavior. You know, right now it's very easy that when the cap raise, you just blindly add liquidity without thinking about these things. But over the course of the next few months, the THORChain community needs to educate themselves that need to take ownership of your own decisions and only add liquidity when it's ready to accept your liquidity, as opposed to it being have no caps. Yeah.
And final closing question from me, which is, with all the innovation happening in THORChain, how is it different from the other decentralized exchanges that are being launched in the Cosmos network coming up very soon, like Gravity DEX, like Osmosis, like CIFChain? You know, would they be in competition for liquidity, or, you know, is there going to be some kind of different dynamic that people should expect?
No, I mean, you can think of the pie as being 99% centralized and 1% decentralized. That was the only case for like 2017, 2018. Uniswap came along and, you know, it's been able to basically take most of the liquidity for ETH and ERC20s out, but still, it's still a minority of the total assets, Dogecoin, Bitcoin, Litecoin, etc. That's still very much dominated by centralized liquidity. So the pie is huge. And, you know, THORChain is mission focused. It's not here to win anything. It's just here to drive everyone down the correct fork in the road. Things like Gravity DEX and Osmosis are helping grow this pie. So they will have different user bases. They are a different niche user case. Both of those, well, Gravity DEX is going to rely on IBC pegged assets to Cosmos Hub. Osmosis is a separate security zone. So they will either have to hook up to Cosmos, which they believe they will, or they'll run their own hubs. But without having a secure peg zone, and I have serious concerns about peg zones that don't have some kind of security coupling to bond, then all these assets can only be pegged and wrapped assets through IBC or peg zones. Whereas, you know, THORChain could conceivably allow decentralized layer 1 connectivity and then mint synthetic versions of yield-bearing synthetic versions. And potentially these synthetic assets can then flow out into the IBC chains. Perhaps, we'll see if that works. But no, nothing's competitive. It's just, you know, a different brand, a different use case, a different set of users, a different narrative. But everyone's helping grow the decentralized liquidity pie. And that's most important, because I don't want to wake up one day and have 80% of the network kicked off Bitcoin because they chose the wrong route. we should all be involved in that now, and choose the right thing today. So yeah, very supportive, and everyone should be very supportive of multiple efforts to solve this.
Absolutely. And with that, we're going to close with the ethos of stay on the Bitcoin standard.
I mean, it's very bullish to see countries across Latin America try and adopt it. The main hurdle is being technical and political, but it seems like Jack Mallers and his crew with Bitcoin Beach and whatnot have largely shown a political leader how it can be solved with their infrastructure. With Lightning, it's semi-custodial Lightning, but it's you can opt out, you can withdraw your liquidity. So yeah, I really hats off to that team. I really hope that they capitalize themselves very, very quickly, and they just start a massive road tour around Latin America. And they rock up and say, hey, look, we've got this infrastructure that's scalable. We can help your country adopt Bitcoin standard literally in 90 days. Are you in? And to a point where these countries can just exit the world's manipulated economic ladder and just decouple themselves. And then if Bitcoin 10x's and they're on the Bitcoin standard, they just 10x the economic standing in the world and completely decoupled it from, our USD strong, USD centric economy that we have today. And I really hope South America and South Africa and all these countries that are on the back foot, they just leapfrog. How mobile phones leapfrog landlines. A Bitcoin-based banking system can leapfrog so much in the way of financial hurdles. There's and like these smaller countries have so much to gain and almost nothing to lose. So you're very unlikely to see something like Australia or Europe or Britain jump ship, because we have a lot to lose with the way we stand in the economic ladder. We don't want to drop a few places if we take the wrong approach. But those on the bottom are definitely going to have an option to jump up. The US will be the last to jump ship, obviously, and you're going to see huge wealth movements where these
wealth transfer between USD, between
Correct.
dollar holders to Bitcoin holders. Yeah,
it's huge. It's going to be huge over the next few decades, and it's just amazing to be part of it and just to see how the economic ladder now just becomes a bench and everyone's sitting at the bench at the same level. Because we have a very distinct economic ladder right now. There are countries that can bully and usurp other countries, whereas the Bitcoin standard humbles everyone. Some people don't like being humbled. Elon Musk is an example of someone who didn't like being humbled by Bitcoin. Bitcoin humbled him, or tried to, and he rejected that. And he embarrassed himself. But we yet to see if maybe Bitcoin was paying Elon was playing some 4D chess with us all, because Elon has definitely been part of the conversation of renewable Bitcoin mining now. And, El Salvador now want to mine Bitcoin with volcanoes, which just sounds like the most chattest thing ever. Like, why wouldn't you want your money to be backed by volcanoes? It just it's such a crazy meme. And like Elon's narrative kind of contributed to that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So maybe he'll chess with us all. I don't know yet.
Well, there is a conspiracy theory or a Elon Powerwall Starlink theory, which is Powerwalls generate surplus energy. They always have an excess electricity. And then if Starlink is able to create essentially an ISP network up in space, then what you could do, if you're as a Powerwall user, you could start mining Bitcoin with Powerwall, and you could start using renewables to mine Bitcoin, and that's not just a pipe dream, right? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, solar on your roof, power on your garage, and mining Bitcoin, and you can suck up that heat, especially if you're like over winter and heat your house or whatever, and just recirculate. Yeah, I mean, and then you can decentralize the grid and decentralize the money at the same time. I mean, like I said, maybe there's some 4D chess going on. That Elon does have that plan, so he just had to awaken the narrative, awaken the issue, and then he comes in 6 months later with the solution. And
very possibly.
I'm still hanging out for it, but we'll see. But no, it's fascinating to see this narrative. Who would have thought 2021 a country to put Bitcoin as legal tender? I mean, it's even on the Wikipedia page right now. So it's crazy stuff. I never thought I'd see this year. I was thinking 2025 or no, not before then.
I guess we're moving at an accelerated pace. Hey, look, we have THORChain, we have DEX innovation, and we no longer need custodians. Even they are allowed to live in this world of the decentralized world with us.
Exactly. And it's permissionless, so you can come anytime you want and leave anytime you want as well. So yeah, cool. Well, thanks very much for the chat. Thanks for the questions, and I enjoyed it. And yeah, hopefully your listeners got something out of it.
Thank you so much for coming on, JP. And thank you for those who are online with us live. We're going to be posting this episode on Interchain FM and Spotify and all of the major distribution channels where you listen to your favorite podcasts in 2 to 3 weeks time. And the next one is going to host, we're going to host IrisNet next, and that's going to happen in July. So I hope to see some of you there. Thank you, everyone. And thank you to the THORChain and Cosmos fam. See y'all in the Cosmos.
Sounds good. See you in the Cosmos.